On February 24th, 1933, gangsters gunned down Dennis Ziegler here in Chicago. Ziegler died in his son's arms. He leaves behind 11 children and his wife, Edna.
I'm Lissa Morgans, and you're listening to Call Edna. Episode 14, The Heavy. Hello and welcome back to Call Edna, the podcast where I solve my great-great-grandfather's Prohibition-era murder. As always, if you want to follow along with the pod, you can do so on Patreon, Instagram, Facebook, etc. Type in Call Edna, and you will find me. Today is a really exciting episode because we're finally diving into a lot of the names from the list that we've made. And I know that list has been daunting, and trust me, it's been over my head just as much as it's over yours as a listener. So in today's episode, we're going to go through 7 people from the list and figure out just how suspicious are we of each of these people. So from our list, we are dealing with the heavy hitters today. And they are James Sammons, nickname Fur, William O'Donnell, nickname Klondike, William White, nickname Jack Three-Fingered White. And for those who have been dying to know, apparently he was sensitive about his right hand, which was mangled in a threshing machine on his father's farm in Iowa, hence the nickname. Marcus Looney, nickname Studdy. Frank Maritote, who I've actually been calling by his nickname, Frank Diamond. He also had an alias named Romano. John Edward Moore, who I've been referring to on this podcast by his alias and nickname, Claude Screwy Maddox. And Daniel Cain. And to the extent possible for each of these people, I want to give you a little bit of background information, placing them in context, find out what they were up to in January and February of 1933, around the time of Bruce's murder, if they were ever arrested or found with a gun on them, and if they were, what type of gun was typically found, and did they have a preference for what they liked to use, and if they died in a suspicious way. And I want to say for the 7 individuals we're going over today, for context, they're all deeply involved in labor racketeering in Chicago at the time of Bruce's murder, and particularly involved in the TNT case, the Trucking and Transport Exchange case that I've mentioned throughout this investigation, but clearly showed how labor racketeers and gangsters had infiltrated various unions, trade organizations, and businesses in order to derive profit as Prohibition was coming to an end. And with that in mind, let's get started with our first person, James Fur Sammons. Sammons has a long criminal history, so I want to walk you through that and then bring us up to date to February of 1933. And his criminal history starts very early on in his life, in 1899. When he was just 16 years old, he was convicted and incarcerated for his first crime, involving a crime against an 11-year-old girl that I'm not going to go into detail on. Just a few years later, in 1903 or 1904, he was actually sentenced to murder for committing a murder during a robbery. That sentence is then eventually commuted to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole, and he's paroled in 1923. Just a few years later, he's back in prison, re-imprisoned in 1925, and then back out. In 1926, he's back at it again with a robbery charge for stealing $85,000 from a payroll and also committing 2 high-level assaults. And in fact, he'll have multiple arrests for armed robbery from 1925 to 1930. In 1930 itself, he's also wanted in connection for the shooting of a police officer who is testifying against one of his friends, Three-Fingered Jack White. He's wanted alongside another one of his buddies, Claude Screwy Maddox. And he's been described as the following: a labor goon, a psychotic murderer, a machine gun executioner, and more. And I wanted to run through this criminal history right off the bat for you to really place exactly who Sammons was for the outfit, because he is very clearly a doer. If you need something taken care of, this is a person you would call. But it's also noted that he had quite an affection for machine guns. So I don't think you would call him unless you really wanted him to go wild. Taking us to February of 1933, There's actually an article in the Belvedere Daily Republican from February 3rd of that year describing a machine gun battle between two rival gangs, and one car had Sammons in it, and he is dressed as a woman wearing a woman's fur coat and hat and using a machine gun against the other side. I'll note that Sammons is also the driver in this incident, and the crew was officially run by Three-Finger Jack White. And this isn't the first time that he had dressed in a disguise. In 1932, he had also disappeared following a violent incident, and when they found him, he had dyed his hair black, shaved his mustache, and was dressed as a college student wearing glasses. Following Bruce's murder, he wasn't in too many headlines in the spring of 1933, but then in July, he's arraigned for assault with intent to commit murder. He's also held on some prior vagrancy charges, and they discussed some robbery charges that are going to be brought forward against him. Later that fall, in November of 1933, a prosecutor in Lake County, Indiana, believes that Sammons has played a role in over 30 bank robberies and begins a prosecution against him there. And at first, I thought this was really interesting that it involved Lake County, Indiana, but Sammons was all over the place in terms of committing crimes. And he's actually wanted at this time, not only in Indiana, but Michigan, Baltimore, Kansas City, and Chicago. So I think it's more just that he used to do crime everywhere and not that Lake County was special to him. And in terms of the gun he liked to use, you've already guessed it. He loved to use machine guns. And apparently it's because he loved hearing the noise. He's actually called by the chief of detectives in the 1930s as a, quote, stir-crazy machine gun murderer. I was only able to find one headline that listed him with a different weapon, an automatic pistol, as opposed to machine gun. And that was in 1930 when the police found him in bed, sleeping with the pistol in a bulletproof vest nearby, likely on a hit. And he dies in May of 1960. And there's nothing particularly suspicious about his death, but I'll note he's actually paroled in 1952 after serving 30 years in incarceration on his prior life sentence. And due to being bedridden with a heart condition and also blind, he's released into the custody of his brother. And it seems like he lives a quiet life until his death in 1960. So there's nothing very suspicious about that. And there's another reason why I also wanted to start with Sammons. And that's because I think we can move him way down our list. From this description and from other things I read, he almost exclusively used machine guns to kill, and he liked to fire a lot of rounds. I read articles where they found up to 37 bullets in a person, and that was very much Sammons' style. Not that he couldn't change it, but I wouldn't say the way in which Bruce was murdered really fits his MO. So let's move on to Klondike O'Donnell. Klondike O'Donnell is described as one of Three-Finger Jack White's henchmen in the 1930s, but he's originally part of a different gang other than the Capone syndicate. He's a part of the West Side O'Donnell gang, which is run by his brother. And there weren't a lot of headlines that were particularly helpful leading up to February of 1933 to place him in proximity to Bruce. In April of 1933, it's noted that he's involved in a fight with the Toohey gang. In May of 1933, it's noted that he's involved with a bombing in Lake Forest, Illinois. Yes, that's located in Lake County, Illinois. He apparently was involved in a bombing of a Union official's home. That official told quite a story of many threats by Murray Humphries, Three-Finger Jack White, and Klondike O'Donnell, and how they had been chasing after him for months to give up his local by giving up his charter and his affiliation with the American Federation of Labor. And in May of 1933, because he was a business agent with the Brotherhood of Teamsters, Chauffeurs, and Helpers, he was holding a meeting in his basement, and that's when the bomb went off. Luckily, no one was seriously injured or killed, but the articles described it as another example of the Union terrorism that was affecting the area in Cook and Lake counties. Fast forwarding to January of 1934, one of the most interesting things that happens with O'Donnell in his life is that he's the main suspect in the murder of Three-Finger Jack White, and it was suspected that White was involved in maybe a double crossing of the other gangsters, and that led to a pretty violent evening. White is shot in his house by two people who had been over for drinks. And there's an eyewitness, a woman who lives on the first floor, unrelated to White and his wife, who provides an identification of the two men who were over earlier in the evening who likely fired the shots against White and then ran. Quoting the January 26, 1934 Chicago Tribune, Lieutenant Wilson said that Mrs. Lena Poots, who lives on the first floor, pointed out Humphries and O'Donnell and a group of 5 men in a photograph which he showed to her. Lieutenant said Humphries and O'Donnell were undoubtedly the Bill and Joe who had been named by White's widow Nancy as the 2 men who had been drinking with her husband when she left the apartment Tuesday evening. End quote. So there were 2 men named Bill and Joe who were over and drinking at White's house. They're there for an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours, before 3 shots are heard. And White is shot 3 times by a .38 caliber revolver. The men, who are described as wearing light overcoats and hats, then flee down the stairs of the building and outside to a coupe with a rumble seat, which I found out is an extra seat on the back of the car, and they take off. And what I find particularly interesting about this is that we have an eyewitness who's not a family member, who's coming forward by name and identifying both Humphries and O'Donnell as the killers. The killers used a .38 caliber revolver, and they fired at very close range. And they were wearing clothing that didn't disguise their identity, but didn't overly show it either, with overcoats and hats. And those facts are not too far off from Bruce's murder. He was shot 3 or 5 times by a revolver at close range. And in the cartoon depiction in the Tribune the day after Bruce is murdered, the man is depicted as wearing an overcoat and a hat. Notably, for Bruce's murder, it was a sedan and not a coupe that was used. And obviously, this is the murder of a high-profile gangster. White was very connected at this time when he was murdered. So I'm not saying that the murders are wholly the same, but there are some definite similarities that make me think that O'Donnell should stay in the running. And confirmed some of my thoughts on Humphries, which is that I think he only got his hands dirty when it was someone very high profile who they had to take care of, like Three-Finger Jack White. In terms of guns that O'Donnell has been associated with, in the 1930s, he's found with 2 pistols under the back seat of his car, along with a bottle of liquor. And there's also a headline in 1933 placing him with a machine gun. So based on what I found, he didn't seem to really have a very specific way of killing or intimidating, but did whatever he needed to meet the situation, whether that was bombing someone's basement, driving around with pistols in his car, firing revolvers at close range, or toting around with a machine gun. But he's definitely someone I want to keep on the list. And that brings us to Three-Fingered Jack White. Three-Fingered Jack White. Starting with his criminal background, in 1919 is the earliest I saw him incarcerated. He went to Joliet Penitentiary for robbery. In 1925, he's paroled and pretty much immediately rearrested, likely for murdering a policeman. And this murder and the way the legal system treats it is fascinating. I won't go through the full rundown, but essentially the case against White is tried twice. Then, the conviction is twice thrown out by the Supreme Court, and eventually the charges are nol prossed or dismissed against White in May of 1932. Quoting from an October 31st, 1930 Chicago Tribune article, White was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment, but the Supreme Court reversed the conviction and ordered a retrial. The prosecution had been dropped until the recent renewed drive on public enemies in the gangs generally. And when the investigator Roche's men arrested White, Chief Justice McGorty ordered the old charge reinstated and the case to be retried, end quote. He's retried for that murder in 1931, and after the case is nol prossed in 1932, he is fully free and he is not recharged for the killing of that policeman. In terms of his involvement with labor racketeering in the 1930s, he was exceptionally close with Red Barker prior to his murder. And leading up to Bruce's murder, many thought that White was involved in the murder of Ted Newberry in January of 1933. As a reminder, Ted Newberry was a rival gangster, and on January 7th of 1933, he was found dead. Another individual who was questioned in the Newbury murder was Murray Humphries. I'm not sure, however, exactly how Newbury was murdered or with what type of weapon. In May of 1933, White is sentenced to a year and a day, very similar to Murray Humphries for gun-toting, and also issued a $300 fine for 2 revolvers that were found in his car. I'm not sure if this is accurate or not, but some articles said that those revolvers were found in his car in 1930, and he's finally charged in 1933 when there's an appetite for prosecution. So much like Humphries and his sentence, he doesn't serve the time imposed. And it does seem like he was normally associated with handguns as opposed to machine guns. In addition to the 2 revolvers I just mentioned, after he dies, the police find in his drawer 2 additional revolvers and a sawed-out shotgun. And his murder is very significant for the outfit. According to the Chicago Tribune, on January 25, 1934, there were 3 main theories about why he was killed. Quoting, "Theories on killing motive. The most plausible of the guesses concerning the slaying motive were 1. That White was, or was suspected of, dealing directly with the government agents and turning up information against prominent criminals. 2. That he had looted a safety deposit box that he and James Fur Sammons had in common and had kept the $80,000 it contained, while Sammons went to serve a life sentence in the Indiana State Prison. 3. That he had failed to make a proper division of the receipts from his titular control of the Teamsters Union with his partners." End quote. And I'll note that he's actually buried next to Red Barker. That's how close they were in life and in death. Given what I've found, he's definitely someone I want to keep on the list. He's likely involved in the murder of Ted Newbury just a month prior to Bruce's murder, and he's very involved in labor racketeering. Next up, Marcus Studdy Looney. Marcus Studdy Looney. He's known for being an official of the Chicago Teamsters Chauffeurs and Helpers Union. And I'll note I didn't find as much on Looney as I was hoping for. There's a pretty big gap from the 19-teens to the 1930s in terms of what he was up to. I have in 1916 that he was already trying to get involved in unions, and he was shot in the head of the Teamsters headquarters. The next time he starts to make some more noise is 1931, and that's when he's named as a suspect in the potential killing of Timothy Lynch and Dan Tegnotti. If you recall from episode 4, The Racket, Lynch and Tegnotti were involved in a standoff with Toohey's gang at a work site. There was a standoff in the 1930 Santa Fe Railroad Yard project, and that's when gangsters like Dan Tegnotti, who were affiliated with Maloney and Barker and White, were telling various workers to stop their job and go on strike. And instead of going on strike, they tried to put up a fight. So the union associated with Timothy Lynch showed up with Toohey's gang as protection to the work site. Both sides point machine guns at one another and threaten to kill each other, and then there's a call made to Maloney. There's a meeting thereafter, and they work out a deal. Lynch's men will get some more money, no one's going to be murdered on that day, and Lynch's men agree to stay out of the city and only work in the suburbs. However, only a month later, Timothy Lynch is murdered, and later that year, so is Dan Tegnotti. And it appears that Looney may have been involved in both. In 1932, he's also part of the group that gets caught for racketeering and conspiracy to collect campaign funds. And I also found something from his personal life in 1932, where apparently he was dating multiple women, and then one of his girlfriends threatened to harm or kill herself when she found out that he was cheating on her, and she swallowed 8 tablets of poison in a taxi. He doesn't really make any headlines in January or February of 1933, but in July of 1933, it said that he controlled the Excavating, Grading, and Teamsters Union, Local Number 731, and according to the Tribune, on July 2nd of 1933, he was, quote, a business agent of the Hoisting Engineers Union, whose members working for the city were called out on strike, end quote. It doesn't specify what Hoisting Engineers Union. I presume it means Local 150 and not Bruce's Local 569, but both were still in existence in July of 1933. Skipping ahead to 1939, he's questioned in the murder of Timothy Dwyer, but it didn't state exactly how Dwyer was murdered or how, and I didn't find any other articles that really specified what type of weapon he used to carry around. In terms of his death, he dies on December of 1948 of a coronary thrombosis while shaving, and it's noted that his wife had died a few years prior. And when it comes to Looney, I feel like he's in the middle of the list mentally for me right now, because of that June 1933 reporting that associated him with both the Hoisting Engineers Union, which I'm presuming is 150, and the Excavating, Grading, and Teamsters Union, which in theory could have been involved with paving in the Cook County and Lake County areas. He's within the sphere of Bruce and his union. So that places him a little closer to Bruce than some of the others we're talking about today. And next up is Frank Diamond. Frank Diamond is Al Capone's brother-in-law, and it's also noted that he was once Al Capone's bodyguard, although I did find a Chicago Tribune article from the 1950s that called this distinction dubious because of the large number of people who had it, which at this point, you've heard me mention many people be Al Capone's bodyguard, so I kind of agree with them. In terms of his criminal background, he's actually at large in July of 1930 after being mentioned in connection with a couple of murders. In January of 1933, just prior to Bruce's murder, he's arrested for driving without a 1933 state license. Apparently, the automobile he was driving had 1932 license plates. The next month, on February 22nd, 2 nights before Bruce's murder, he's found not guilty of disorderly conduct for refusing to submit to arrest during that automobile stop. So we know that he wasn't incarcerated or otherwise indisposed at the time of Bruce's murder. And I'll note that I'm not actually sure if he was found not guilty. I take a lot of the legal rhetoric with a grain of salt when I'm reading through these historic newspapers, because there's a lot of contradictions, even in modern media, about what exact legal consequence happened. And there are many ways for a case to end. So I'm not sure if the judge found him not guilty, if a jury found him not guilty, or if the judge just dismissed the case due to lack of evidence. Because later on in the article, the judge apparently said, quote, "I'll dismiss the case." So I'm not sure what the motivation was, but regardless, the case is dismissed. A couple months later, in May of 1933, he gets involved in a dispute with Steve Sumner and the Milk Drivers Union, along with Murray Humphries, Three-Finger Jack White, and Marcus Studdy Looney. In May of 1933, the Tribune reports on what Frank Diamond had been up to in the labor racketeering sphere, along with his friends Three-Finger Jack White, Murray Humphries, and Marcus Looney. Apparently, in the prior year, in May of 1932, they approached Steve Sumner and the Milk Drivers Union. As a reminder, Steve Sumner is the author of the speech from April of 1933 after Bruce's death, who he referenced that Bruce was talking to leading up to his murder. And apparently, in May of 1932, Diamond started approaching Sumner directly. Quoting from the Tribune article, on May 11, 1933, Sumner, who is 74 years old, said that Diamond told him the organization controlled judges, police officials, and legislators in the United States and Canada, whom they had elected, and can get you out of trouble in 2 hours, end quote. As we know, the approaches towards Sumner were not successful, but I wanted to include this not only because it involves Frank Diamond, but because this is a month after Sumner had spoken out about Bruce's murder, and now he's speaking out about prior things that have happened in the last year involving these violent labor racketeers. And in 1943, Frank Diamond gets caught up in the same indictment charges that Frank Nitti and others got caught up in New York for extortion, conspiracy, and mail fraud. And this is when we get some insight into Diamond's personality. He's arrested by U.S. Marshals, and then he's transported to New York for a hearing. And then apparently during the hearing, there's newspaper photographers taking pictures of him, which he doesn't like, and he ends up attacking a newspaper photographer for taking his picture in what is described as, quote, a wild fury. Other articles also noted his, quote, ungovernable temper. so he had a bit of an anger management problem. He does end up being sentenced for extorting over $1 million from the movie industry, but is paroled in 1948. In 1952, it's rumored that he was involved in the death of another union official, Anthony Baldino, who was found shot through the head in his automobile and also had appeared to have been beaten up prior to his death. So somewhat like Bruce in that he was shot through the head, and not like Bruce in that Bruce was not beaten up or otherwise questioned prior to his murder in that way. In terms of anything I found relating to him and specific types of guns, he was caught carrying a loaded pistol at 2 times in his life by the police in 1928 and 1930. I didn't see any articles associating him with preferring machine guns to pistols or anything like that. And his death ends up being suspicious. He's murdered by unknown people while pulling his car into his own garage in August of 1954. His 4-year-old son, who was in the car with him at the time, survives, but Diamond is hit by several shotgun blasts. And when he was shot, he was actually the second of 7 Capone gangsters who were murdered in a 3-day period and involved in the New York extortion case. So it's pretty clear he was silenced by someone. And his murder is more similar to William Drury. I think this was a common technique to get people in a predictable spot where they were still vulnerable. In terms of keeping him on the list, I think it's important that Sumner mentioned him in a group of gangsters that he was particularly upset with involving labor racketeering a month after he wrote about Bruce's murder. I think it's important that he mentioned Frank Diamond, Murray Humphries, Three-Finger Jack White, and Marcus Studdy Looney. But beyond that, there's nothing really specific connecting Diamond to Bruce's case. And next we have Claude Screwy Maddox. Claude Screwy Maddox, whose real name is actually John Edward Moore, was originally part of the old circus gang in Chicago and was actually questioned in the St. Valentine's Day Massacre of 1929. And then, in 1930, he likely shot and wounded a cop who was going to testify against Jack Three-Finger White. He's also questioned for the murdered Alfred Lingle, the Chicago Tribune reporter from 1930, a callback to episode 2, The List, who was shot to death while walking in the subway under Michigan Avenue. In addition to being a newspaperman, it was clear after his death that he was also some type of bookie, that he was also a bagman for the Chicago's Commissioner of Police and working in some way with Dan Gilbert and the Chicago outfit. In 1931, he's indicted for attempting to murder a policeman, and even though it's quite likely that he did shoot a cop who was going to testify against Three-Finger Jack White, he went free because there was a witness who recanted. In terms of what he was doing in February of 1933, there were no specific articles or whereabouts about what he was up to. We know he was the power behind Local 450, the Hotel and Restaurant Employees Union, which is also in some articles called the Chicago Bartenders, Waiters, and Waitresses Union. But there's nothing in the winter of 1933 that really sticks out placing him anywhere. Later on in the year, he's considered very close friends with Murray Humphries in a series of articles from June to September, where he's suspected to be involved in a prison break involving the murder of 5 men in order to break someone out of prison, and a mail robbery case, and then another killing of a policeman. So Maddox was known for being quite violent. And as the years go on, I'm not exactly sure what exact years this happens, but he owns an infamous club in Cicero called the Paddock Lounge, which was located at 4833 Cermak Road. And later, this is apparently called the Turf Club. In my research, I couldn't exactly find when it went from one to the other, but I know the Paddock Lounge was in existence in the mid to late 1930s, and I think the Turf Club was more 40s and 50s. And this was a really important spot where members of the outfit would meet up in Cicero. Traveling ahead to May of 1943, he's involved in the murder of Danny Stanton, the Southside boss of labor and gambling, who was shot to death in a saloon. Stanton had been around for a long time, but apparently when Maddox replaced Murray Humphries as the man in control of the unions, Stanton didn't respect Maddox in the new position in the same way he respected Humphries. In terms of headlines indicating violent conduct of what type of gun he used to use, it does seem like he did like machine guns, and it was said that he was quite handy with one. He used a sawed-off shotgun in that 1930 attempted murder of the cop who was testifying against Jack Three Finger White, named McBride. And the way they got at McBride is straight out of a movie. Apparently, McBride was in the streetcar and sitting at a spot near the window, and a sedan containing Maddox and others pulled up alongside of it, placed the sawed-off shotgun out the window, and fired. Other than that, there weren't other headlines about him using a pistol or a handgun, and his death is slightly suspicious. He dies in his sleep of a heart attack in June of 1958, but at the time, he's on the committee list to testify before the McClellan Committee from Episode 5, the committee that Kennedy and others were presiding over regarding a federal investigation of labor racketeering, and Maddox had recently served a 10-month prison term for violating an anti-gambling device act called the Johnson Act, and he was delaying testifying before the committee because of a heart condition. So it could be completely innocent that he then dies of a heart attack, and I know heart conditions are quite common, but he's not our only gangster who dies by himself at home of a heart attack when he's wanted for questioning elsewhere. As we know, Murray Humphries was finally caught by FBI agents. He briefly went to jail and then he made bail, and he was dead on the same evening, having suffered a heart attack while vacuuming his house. He also had a heart condition, so it's not to say this couldn't have happened, but it's not the first time that someone's wanted on federal questioning, and instead of providing answers, disappears into the night. In terms of Maddox's connection to Bruce, I'm pretty comfortable placing him either off the list or towards the end of it. Although he's a violent member of the Chicago outfit at the time of Bruce's murder, he's often found in a group with Jack White and others in 1933 and makes headlines in that regard. But considering the other gangsters at this point who have much more of a connection to Bruce's union, and this case in general, I'm pretty comfortable placing him off to the side for now. It also seems like he preferred to use a machine gun as opposed to a pistol in the couple of murders he's caught for. It also seems like he often used a machine gun in his violent attempts on others' lives as opposed to a revolver or a pistol, which doesn't fit Bruce's murderer's profile. Next up, Daniel Cain. Daniel Cain is the man we added to the list as someone who is wanted for questioning in Bruce's murder, and he was known as the former president of the Chicago Teamsters Union and a brother-in-law to Red Barker, which means he was close with both Red Barker and Jack Three-Fingered White. And his biggest association is with the TNT case, more than it's with violence. According to the May 9, 1933 Chicago Tribune article, quoting, TNT edges into picture. The association had been dealing directly with the union for 25 years, until the TNT came into the picture in 1931, said Mr. Fleming. The union heads, John Sheridan Jr., Milton Booth Jr., and Cain, told us that they had given the TNT the power to negotiate their wage agreements. We couldn't understand the function of the TNT at the time, but we went along. We have since gained a clear idea of the TNT's operations. In the negotiations of December 1931, Mr. Fleming explained the scale for 1932 was set at $8 for a 10-hour day for truck drivers and $5 a day for helpers. Against each employer signing, he said, the TNT assessed a $10 yearly registration fee and a $1 monthly fee per truck. The TNT hid its racketeering hand for a whole year until negotiations for the 1933 contract came up last December, Mr. Fleming said. This time, he declared, Cain, Booth, and Sheridan gave notice that the TNT power of the negotiation was to extend for 3 years instead of 1, end quote. So instead of being involved in a lot of violent crime, I'm more seeing Cain as involved in a lot of labor racketeering, and he's also willing to disappear when needed. He's listed as awaiting trial in May of 1934, but then in November of the same year, it said that he actually hasn't been caught by officials in order to be tried. But besides the TNT information, there's really not a lot on Cain, and I'm pretty confused as to why he was named in Bruce's murder when from what I understand, Bruce was not involved in TNT. There was nothing in Bruce's papers or otherwise that I found that mentioned TNT. And in fact, in 1931, he was very focused on Huddle and Maloney, on things associated within his union and fighting the amalgamation process. So although we just added Cain because I found a newspaper article that suggested he was wanting for questioning, unless I'm able to find additional information, I'm actually going to take him back off the list. I think he's someone very clearly involved in labor racketeering, but not so involved in the actual carrying out of hits like Bruce's. And I don't think his involvement in labor racketeering could ever supplant William Maloney's, who had a very clear motive to kill Bruce. So what's our next step? We've gone through a lot of the list that we created on this podcast today, and there's so much to discuss. As someone who loves a list, all I want to do is write a number from 1 to 10 and start placing these names in order. But there's still a couple more people we need to get through, specifically 2 associated with Edna's list, Lloyd Little and John Lynch, although we did discuss Lynch a bit in the Maloney episode, and then someone added to the list by Dodie Ziegler, one of Bruce and Edna's children, and that's William Green. So before we can make our official list, we have to discuss those people. And before we discuss them, I wanted to bring you back to these competing fact patterns that we have in our case. Of course, we know so much about Bruce's murder, but with all the information I learned in the attic, I want to present the fullest picture I have of what exactly happened on February 24th of 1933. And I've held off on presenting it in hopes that I would have the police records. But so far, all of my requests have come back the same. After reasonable search, no files were found. I still have one Hail Mary request remaining, but I wanted to give you a full accounting of what we found in the attic, what Bruce was up to in his life in the late 1920s and early 1930s, and a fuller picture of every newspaper article that was reported on at the time about Bruce's murder, so that we can finally decide some of these larger questions that I discussed with Danny, like how many shots were fired and how many people are we looking for. So that'll be our next episode. I'll see you in the attic.